Good evening. I'm Harry Keeling, and on behalf of Alaska Public Media and the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation, welcome to Hangar Flying. Our guest this evening is a very experienced pilot whom I have known for more than 25 years. Keith Earley grew up in Dayton within earshot of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. More on that in a minute, in fact, from Keith himself. Keith and I first met when we both were flying A-10s at Eielson. Keith has not only flown the A-10, but the F-16 and the F-5. Keith, thank you for your service.
Well, thank you very much.
After the Air Force, Keith moved into corporate aviation, flying the Hawker 800, Gulfstream 1, and the Sabre 6.5. Later, Keith then went to FedEx, where he flew 727, DC-10, then came to Alaska in the MD-11. Welcome, Keith. Let's start by going back to your early enthusiasm for flying. Talk about your father's influence in the Air Force Museum.
Well, my father grew up just a few blocks from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and as a teenager in the 50s, he was eyewitness to the test aviation that was going on at that time. Wright-Patterson was a test base, and they were the eastern version of Edwards Air Force Base. So when the new jets were being developed, he and a friend got a close-up view of that. And they actually crawled in the sewer pipe under the fence around the air base up into the base and watched strange airplanes take off, flown by who knows who, but I'm sure they were pioneers in aviation and jet aviation. So his interest was then passed on to me because he took me to Wright-Patterson Air Force Museum over and over and over again, practically every year. And then after that to the Dayton Air Fair, where I stood not more than a few hundred yards from F-5s, F-105s and F-104s with their hard afterburner lights taking off the runway, and I couldn't have been more impressed as a young boy. So later on I had an opportunity to live a dream that I never imagined for myself when I applied for a scholarship in the Air Force and received one and was sent to pilot training.
So your passion for aviation has always been obvious to me, and you told a story that I'd like to have you repeat for our audience, talking about a particular night mission up at Eielson.
Okay, well, when I came to Eielson in 1989, it was literally on the first day of what was a record cold snap. If anybody was here at the time, it was something like 45 days in a row where it never got warmer than 35 below zero. Well, that was my introduction to Alaska because I arrived on day one of that. After a few daytime flights, I was required to take a nighttime training sortie where I was being checked out as a flight lead, and I was a major at the time, and my instructor and I were to go up to the Yukon River where we were to meet up with a tanker, take on some fuel, and then drop down, fly a low level to a bombing range, drop some bombs under flares, and then come back to the base and land. Well, I have quite a bit of mountain flying experience in the southwest United States, but that is not mountain flying as we know it here in Alaska. And that experience is nothing like flying in Alaska. So I had the most wide-eyed, eye-opening experience on that first flight I'd like to tell you about. We took off on an icy runway at Eielson, flew up to the Yukon River where we met our tanker. And the tanker, we came up behind it 1,000 feet low and behind it. Well, it just happened to be skylighted against the most brilliant northern lights. You can't imagine how brilliant they were, but they were at a very slight angle to the horizon. Well, when you have to pull up and plug into a tanker, and the tanker is completely surrounded by these angled lights, it was very disorienting. I had the worst case of vertigo that I probably have had in my life. I literally felt as if our airplanes were pointed straight at the earth as I was trying to hook up to this refueling boom and take on my fuel. Well, we got through that, and then it was time to proceed down to the range, which is a few hundred miles to the south. We dropped down to 1,000 feet above the highest terrain in the sectors we were in, and it was also a full moon night. And this was my first real look at the Alaska landscape, but it was under a full moon and under the northern lights in the wintertime. And as far as I could see in any direction, it was nothing but glaciated mountains, not a single ground light in sight anywhere. and I felt like I was looking down on God's earth the way it was created in the very beginning. And I was so impressed by that, I turned out all the lights in the cockpit and just sat there in silence with my jaw hanging down about right here, admiring what was in front of me. We went from there to the bombing range, popped some flares which came down in parachutes, 2 million candle power lit up the targets. We dropped our bombs on those targets, came back and landed on that same icy covered runway, fishtailing down the runway, off the runway, taxiing on ice covered taxiways back to the ramp. Came inside the squadron building, and my instructor pilot and I basically high-fived each other saying, was that incredible or what?
That's a great story, and you always tell it so well. I want to get you on again at least one more time and talk a little bit more about some of your flying experiences. I appreciate you being on the program tonight.
Well, thank you for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed tonight's program. We'll get Keith on next time, and until then, fly safe.